Now I would like to welcome Ms. Thuli Madonsela, and who is the public protector of South Africa, and she has served as the advocate of the High Court of South Africa as a human rights and constitutional lawyer and an administrative investigator. She is also an equality expert and policy specialist. Now, her statement will be about state sovereignty and international responsibility to guard human rights, revisiting South Africa's history during apartheid. And just because, Madam Madonsela, because you were not here in the beginning, we are trying to stick to, it used to be 5 to 7 minutes, but I think we are up to Afghan 7 minutes, but about 10 minutes maximum. So please, you have the floor.
Thank you. My apology for being late. Greetings to all of you colleagues, and particularly warm greetings from South Africa. I would like to thank our colleague, the Honorable Okmanda Johansen, for inviting us, particularly myself, to participate in this dialogue. I thank for the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy for bringing us together, and also for inviting me to be just part of this group. Lastly, thank you to the city for hosting us, particularly for yesterday's very warm welcome. I've been asked to speak, as has been indicated by the chairperson, to speak on state sovereignty and international responsibility to guard human rights in the context of revisiting South Africa's history during apartheid. For me, this is quite timely, because yesterday we were celebrating Freedom Day, which is April 27. And on a day such as yesterday, we reflect on the days or the path we have taken since we became a democracy 22 years ago. Why is it important for me to combine the two is because part of the reason we gained freedom in South Africa 22 years ago was because of the international community's involvement in the struggle against apartheid. This happened at different levels by individuals as far away as this part of the world, Iceland, participating in the anti-apartheid movement. There was also activities that happened in the UN itself, which resulted in the UN declaring apartheid a crime against humanity in March 21, an International Day on Anti-Racism. When we meet at an event like this, we then ask ourselves, why did human rights activists from all over the world, including this country, which is very small and far in the north, believe that the interracial conflict and suffering of Black people in South Africa was their problem? Now, I believe the reason people engage in human rights on matters that are so far away from them is the same reason the founder of the ICD, Mark Donfried, founded the ICD. It's probably the same reason we have similar forums such as the Joburg Forum, the World Justice Forum, the World Economic Forum, among others. And possibly the UN, African Union, and EU are founded in similar principles. And I think it's principles of human compassion, human solidarity. In my view, those who participated in extending support to the struggle in South Africa were driven by compassion for fellow human beings, but also for compassion for themselves based on the understanding of the interconnectedness of humanity. In South Africa, we call that spirit the spirit of Ubuntu, which is about caring for fellow human beings on the understanding that I am because you are, and that my future is better guaranteed if your future is guaranteed. But you also agree with me that transnational involvement in local human rights violations and invariably politics is viewed with suspicion, particularly when the powerful nations are seen as being able to do things with impunity when smaller and less powerful nations are checked when there are excesses with regard to dealing with human beings. So perhaps some of that criticism is fair, given the fact that there's always complaint that in the name of international solidarity, there are concepts such as regime change, and there are often concerns around how far does benevolence extend, and when does benevolence end and self-interest takes over. Despite those problems, though, we all agree that the world can't just look the other way. We all know that as long as there is injustice somewhere, there can't be sustainable peace anywhere. Because if we look the other way, the trouble, no matter where it is, anywhere in the world, will eventually find us. And when we were in Berlin, we were discussing, for example, the problem of the global economic meltdown, terrorism, the refugee problem, the rise of global extremism. All of those start somewhere in the world, but eventually they catch up with all of us. Meaning, therefore, whatever happens anywhere in the world is our concern, regardless of where we are in the world. My challenge to us, though, is the whole question of how do we manage this thing, the whole question of state sovereignty and violation of human rights. How do we manage it in such a way that we limit the concerns? Let's start with a quote from former President Nelson Mandela in South Africa. He said the following: "Even the most benevolent of governments are made up of people with all the propensities for human failings. The rule of law, as we understand it, consists in the set of conventions and arrangements that ensure that it is not left to the whims of individual rulers to decide what is good for the populace. The administrative conduct of government and authorities are subject to the scrutiny of independent organs." Of course, President Mandela was speaking about organs inside South Africa that are there to make sure that they check excesses in this exercise of state power by government. I believe, though, this applies globally when we're looking at the exercise of state power within states and the checking of that exercise of state power by institutions and organs at a global level. Where does it start? Clearly, the issue of sovereignty is what has held peace across the globe. That when states are guaranteed that their territory will be respected and their exercise of authority over that territory will be respected, there's a limit to international wars. And this obviously is something that informed the United Nations Charter many years ago. And the idea of course, respecting boundaries whilst making sure that there was some form of global governance was about developing friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and to take the appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace. So it was always about strengthening universal peace whilst whilst respecting territorial boundaries. However, former President Nelson Mandela tells us that, well, in those territorial boundaries, I'm just now wrapping up, in those territorial boundaries, even the most benevolent of rulers would end up having propensities for human failings. Well, some of them start off as not benevolent at all. They just would be delinquent regimes from the start. And the question is then, how do you respect those territorial boundaries at the same time not looking the other way when there are human rights violations? As we've indicated that when those human rights violations happen, the world will eventually suffer because the ecosystem that we all live in will be affected. Whether it be affected in terms of food security for all of us if agricultural resources are disturbed, or the human condition leads to people becoming refugees, or the human condition leads to people gravitating towards extremism and unleashing global terrorism. So it becomes our global concern. But I think what I would pose to colleagues and to everyone just in ending is, how do we manage then the limits of what I refer to as benevolence? That even as we intervene from a global perspective, we're driven by benevolence, but at one stage do we cross the line between benevolence and self-interest? Because firstly, we intervene because of the interconnectedness of humanity. But the interconnectedness of humanity also means we're protecting ourselves. Is that it's sort of a preventative strike, that you want to limit the problem for wherever it is before it comes and harms you. But at one stage, do we see some of those preventative strikes as aggression on their own and becoming part of the problem as opposed to part of the solution? Sorry about that. Sorry. Who watches the watchman, so to speak? Who guards the guardians? If you look at the United Nations, if you look at the UN Security Council, who watches them today? I would want to leave you with the understanding that when the United Nations and the global community assisted South Africa, the lines were a little bit more clearer than today regarding right and wrong. They were also a little bit more clearer regarding what is a violation of human rights and when do we step in as the global community. I'm not sure whether today the lines are as clear as they used to be. But having said that, even raising those questions about benevolence and excesses, I'm quick to say, act we must. We just have to be careful to understand that unchecked power does create risks for corruption, unchecked power. Whether it's unchecked power by global governance agencies or by regimes at a local level, when there is that unchecked situation, there is a higher risk of corruption. Clearly, at a local level, though, it's much easier for regimes to, who are guilty of excesses, to blame the international community for interference. And I'll leave the full paper at some stage where I've written about some of these things. But my answer to that is that we shouldn't just step back purely because we're afraid of being accused of interference. There has to be some level of interference, or there has be some level of intervention. However, that intervention by global agencies needs to be checked itself. And my last contribution to the debate would be, perhaps at a global level, we need a higher involvement of civil society, a higher involvement of checking the guardians, which would be the global agencies, to make sure that the line between benevolence and self-interest is not crossed. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Madonsela, and I think you posed a lot of questions that can be discussed later. I just wanted to, following your intervention, of course, with apartheid, because, it's a primary example of justice prevailing. And it's really something that one can refer to when we have other situations in the world that people think are never, ever going to end. Mm. And then it's, one can point to South Africa. That's one example. And I just have to say on a personal basis, because one of the very nice experiences that I had was I was in Palestine during the elections in 2006. And then there was an observer mission from South Africa. And I thought, because I was, very much involved in the struggle against apartheid earlier, it was really something like that one thought never would have happened, So it's but also with who watches the Security Council and the UN, I think that's a very interesting question to discuss later.